And we are, supposedly, for real this time, live. I'm here with Avialae, Horton, and we are here to debate the homosexuality question. Not whether it's okay or not, but the motion is homosexuality is an integral part of Western civilization. The plan is
And we are, supposedly, for real this time.
my self-monitoring going astray there. So the order of events we're going to do is we're going to start with 10-minute opening arguments, followed up by 8-minute rebuttals, followed by 15 minutes of back and forth, roughly, followed by 5-minute conclusions. We'll try to stick roughly to that so we don't go over everyone's listening time. And Avialae, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, has agreed to go first.
All right, sounds good. So, with this position that I have regarding homosexuality in Western civilization, the thing is that it's very easy for many people to misinterpret my position because they misconstrue the fact that I differentiate between what I call homosexuality and homosexual culture. I think that is a very important differentiation to make in understanding my initial position so that moving forward it's easier to sort of understand where my argument is coming from in this kind of position. So obviously, part of Western civilization is acknowledging our past, our history, and the cultural, philosophical, and societal ideals of our ancestors in moving forward and hoping to create ideal societies modeled after those that we so famously admire throughout history. So we know in times of antiquity, like in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, we do know that homosexuality was present. Now, something that I often mention in my discussions of homosexuality is the fact that, like I said, homosexuality in itself is different than the modern culture that revolves around it. It is, in my opinion, an act of the left in subverting homosexuality and creating around it this entire cultural ideal where essentially every portion of your identity revolves around your sexuality. I personally find this to be an incredibly superficial way to express oneself and their identity. I think that there is so much more to acknowledge in a person, which I believe you would agree, of course, there, Chris, that extends beyond their sexuality. That is merely one portion of what creates an individual and what goes into their identity. So I feel like that, first and foremost, is a problem as a result of postmodern society, that we have come to look at them as being solely objectified according to their sexuality because this defines their whole character. And this in itself is a completely erroneous assumption and argument. Now, in the times of antiquity, in the times of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, which I often discuss in these debates, I bring up the fact that homosexuality was present, but I also think that it's important to acknowledge the fact that they didn't create these entire identities around their sexuality. There wasn't this obsession about it like there is today. It wasn't this entirely different classification like it is today. It was merely considered a normality in some places. There are numerous historical examples to reinforce that statement. I mean, we could look at, for example, some of the earliest philosophical works. As I've mentioned previously, we could discuss the Symposium and Plato's work, in which he actually emphasized that he personally believed, according to the representations of the characters that he used, that in terms of physical love, that of homosexual men was considered to be the most ideal because of his admiration for masculinity. That also indicates to us the fact that this notion in our modern society that it's necessary for a gay man to be incredibly effeminate, or the notion that it's necessary for a lesbian woman to be very masculine, is in itself an entirely erroneous notion. This notion that one must completely disregard all forms of normality in terms of gender identity is, in fact, incorrect. So we look at that in comparison, and we see that in comparison to today's society, homosexuals would be considered, I suppose, relatively normal. There wasn't this enormous differentiation between them necessarily. So I think that is very significant in discussing this argument first and foremost. Now, going back to what I was mentioning about the Symposium, Plato discusses in frequency the presence of homosexuality, and he discusses in terms of what he considers to be an ideal society. He actually points out if only there were a way to start a city or an army made up of lovers and the boys they love, theirs would be the best possible system of society, for they would hold back from all that is shameful and seek honor in each other's eyes. Even a few of them in battle side by side would conquer all the world, I would say. For a man in love would never allow his loved one of all people to see him leaving ranks or dropping weapons. He'd rather die 1,000 deaths. I think that this is an incredibly important point to acknowledge here. Now, of course, one may disagree with Plato's assumption that homosexual relations between men is, of course, what he considered to be the most ideal form of love. But I think he was onto something in his acknowledgement that honor and virtue and what Plato would consider to be good in philosophical terms is likewise available to homosexuals. That our modern interpretation of homosexuality is in itself incredibly crass and superficial due to the fact that we've created these entire identities that revolve around our sexuality. So that's a very important point to acknowledge. Now, I did mention the fact that I consider it to be completely and entirely inaccurate to assume that homosexuals must by necessity dismiss all gender norms. And this is something I think is just very, very prominent. And it's a common misconception because in our modern society, that tendency is quite real. I've often said that I believe that modern homosexual culture is the attempt by the left to essentially subvert homosexuals in the same way that they've attempted to subvert heterosexuals with hookup culture. It is essentially the desecration of what would be loving and virtuous relationships in favor of crass hedonism. And I think that is the root of the problem, essentially. It all goes back to that problem that we see both in heterosexual and homosexual relationships. Now, we could look at various examples throughout history, but in particular, I am discussing the period of antiquity. So there's a few examples I could go with there. We could look at the historical Sacred Band of Thebes, which was a Greek army that consisted solely of homosexual lovers, 150 pairs of them, which would be 300 in all. We could look at several different myths. We could look at the myths of Nisus and Euryalus from the Aeneid. We could look at several different examples like that from mythological perspectives. We could look at the historical work of Sappho and her poetry. We could look at all different kinds of things like that. So there are a plethora of examples there that are present in terms of both historical context and the context of the stories that were crafted by the Greeks and the Romans as well. So I think that this paints an incredibly fascinating picture in not only understanding the frequency of homosexuality in those periods of time in what we would consider to be classical cultures that have contributed directly to Western civilization, but also due to the fact that it shows how incredibly crass our modern interpretations of homosexuality is and how it has been hypersexualized to such a degree that it has essentially encompassed all aspects of our identity. And this is poisonous, and I've always believed that. And I believe the same to be the case of heterosexuals, of course. You know, just emphasizing nothing more than your sexual attractions to individuals would be, in my opinion, its own form of degeneracy. Nietzsche actually said the same in one of his texts. I believe it was either in Twilight of the Idols or the Antichrist. I believe it was Twilight of the Idols, in which he was talking about degeneracy. And he said essentially that degeneracy can also be defined in the fact that it is the refusal to put away radicalized tendencies. And I think that is very prevalent here when we're looking in terms of sexuality and the fact that we've adopted such radicalized notions of sexuality that they encompass all aspects of our lives. So I think that this points out something that needs to be acknowledged first and foremost in these kind of discussions, because we have such a crass and gross interpretation of homosexuals in general in postmodern society due to the fact that it has been so grossly distorted by several different societal factors, whether you look at those as being elements of the left, cultural Marxism, whatever you'd like to call it. So I think that is an incredibly important point, first and foremost, that I wanted to clarify and reiterate going forward in my position, because it explains a little bit clearer where I'm coming from, I think. So I think that acknowledging all of these things, these historical examples, the examples in philosophy and the philosophical works of these different early thinkers, and all of these different examples provide a very clear picture in terms of the contributions and the relevance of homosexuals in Western civilization and how pertinent those are to Western civilization and understanding its classical origins, essentially. So I think that summarizes pretty efficiently where my position regarding this issue resides, and it basically clarifies where I'm coming from. And the fact is that ultimately, in terms of philosophical context, we see that a lot of these individuals were just like other heterosexual males, in the fact that despite having a different sexuality, they still retain some level of masculinity, unlike the tendency that we see today regarding the desecration of traditional gender roles.
Is that the end of your opening argument?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, I will move on to my opening argument. I won't be addressing any of your points yet, or at least any addressing of them will be incidental, because we'll just be reading off my opening argument, and then everything after this opening will be off the cuff, so we'll see how that goes.
Of course.
So, all right, I'll begin. So this subject actually reminded me of a debate that happened back in 2013 in Cambridge. The subject, or the motion, was the following: religion has no place in the 21st century. In the affirmative were Andrew Copson, Richard Dawkins, and Arif Ahmad, who made a relatively strong case, which the believing opposition, represented by Rowan Williams and Tariq Ramadan, were unable to effectively counter. And then the final debater took the stage, an atheist writer, so not a believer, and a columnist named Douglas Murray. His argument was not that religion was true, or that the claims made by Copson, Dawkins, and Ahmed were wrong, but that they went too far. In a brilliant turnaround, Murray argued against the arrogance of atheism as a movement, about what they miss, and its neglect of what religion gets right, and for which atheism has no real answer. His speech not only made up for Williams's and Rowan's poor performance, but in fact won the debate with 328 votes against the affirmative's 138. I bring this up because I feel a little bit like Murray did, somewhat uncomfortably taking on a position which I broadly agree with, the acceptance of homosexuality and homosexuals in the right, but which has gone too far in this case. Perhaps the irony is at my own expense that Murray himself, the first right-wing intellectual I began to follow seriously, is gay. He is, of course, not the only homosexual right-winger I've come to enjoy. Milo Yiannopoulos was highly inspirational to me, especially in his earlier, slightly more serious years. Not only have I had the enjoyment of reading Jack Donovan's and Greg Johnson's work, but have had the privilege of meeting them and consider them both to be friends, as I consider Avialae to be a friend. There are others I've known, whose names I won't reveal, who share conservative, traditional, and right-wing views. I'm proud to call these people my friends as well. Furthermore, I believe that much of the right-wing opposition to homosexuality has nothing whatsoever to do with Christian theology or other traditionalism, which sees homosexuality as a sin, but sees every man, woman, and child as a sinner, and no sin save one as worse than others. Nor does it have anything to do with political philosophy. The arguments those people tend to make are weak and leave no conceptual room for the division of labor. They tacitly assume that everyone, not merely most people or some people, but everyone, is responsible for creating traditional families and the culture necessary for their success. If I were a neuroscientist, I'd guess an overstimulated disgust circuitry, and not thought-through philosophy, is behind most right-wing opposition to homosexuality. None of this, however, makes homosexuality an integral part of Western civilization. It could get on just fine without gay relationships. I will go even further and say that homosexuality is not just an inessential component of Western civilization, but an unfortunate one, precisely because it runs counter to the central building block of our culture, which is the traditional family. I'm not saying that all men and women must be members of a traditional family within a Western culture, as many of those I disagree with believe, but that some must, because the family, specifically the male-female bond of marriage, is the heart and pulse of the West. It can get along fine without the people who will not reproduce, even those who contribute significantly to its art, history, strength, and thought. It cannot get along fine without families. The institutions of religion, of law, and of labor all orbit the unique form of marriage that defines our civilization, even more than the somewhat overemphasized individual. There are countless inventions, achievements, creations, and stories in Western culture which were given to us by people who loved members of their own sex. But would the West cease to be the West without these people? Would it cease to be the West had their sexuality been more strongly contained and controlled? I think the answer to this is obvious. But it's worth digging into the deeper question before passing judgment, just so we can be absolutely clear. What is the West exactly? The West is a combination of language, religion, institutions, and survival strategies, all of which are products of the people who created them. So I think it's worth our time to briefly work through the history of these people. The people of the West are the people of Europe, which themselves are an amalgamation of three previously distinct groups. About 20,000 years ago, the original European people settled the continent. They were egalitarian and collectivist, hunter-gatherers, and are responsible for the light skin, blonde hair, and pale eyes some of us have today. Then about 7,000 years ago, a small number of Semitic farmers moved into Europe and settled there, especially in the south. And then finally, about 4,500 years ago, the warlike Indo-European people rode in from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Each of these groups left their cultural, linguistic, religious, and genetic marks on the people of Europe, and their combination, interaction, and conflict gave us the Western civilization that we have inherited. We have the scavenging resourcefulness of hunter-gatherers, and the courage and fearlessness of the Indo-Europeans, mixed with the seasonal awareness of time and connection to the earth that has always characterized agriculture in the geography of Europe. Conversely, we lack the relaxed leisure and tranquility of many tropical island cultures, nor do we have the diligent, tireless work ethic of Eastern Asians, whose fertile rice paddies rewarded work in a linear fashion year-round, no matter how repetitive the work. And perhaps most glaringly of all, we lack the fierce tribal loyalty, which especially characterized the people of Central Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, who survived as nomadic herdsmen, and whose honor cultures were effective, but left little room for meritocracy outside the extended family. These qualities, shaped by thousands of years of marital interweaving of genetics and geography, are the progenitors of the West. Now, where in the vast expanse of this history, responsible for everything we experience as our civilization today, stretching back 20,000 years, where in that expanse is the necessity of homosexuality? Where is its true significance? The virtues, gods, languages, and technologies of these groups are the result of their survival strategies. Though homosexuality may be a result, they are not a driving nor a necessary force. However, the cultural expectations which are required for homosexuality to be accepted, which are a certain degree of openness and tolerance to counteract the aforementioned disgust circuits, have resulted in accepting a great number of other people who are not Western. Reminding ourselves of the scale of migration which forged us into the people we are, and seeing how forces of a historical scale we haven't seen in 4,500 years, and which dwarfs the scale of even the greatest classical thinkers in terms of creating us into the people we are now. None of that in any way says we should reject homosexuality or homosexuals. It should, however, remind us of how insignificant the gays of the past have been in creating Western civilization. It also puts into context what is being asked in the proposition, that the force most likely to preserve Western civilization, the discussed circuitry of right-wing men, be kept in check. Our ideal, of course, is not an either-or, but a balance, We want tolerance, but also exclusion. This balance, I submit, is not best achieved by falsely labeling homosexuality as an integral part of our civilization. In my estimation, it is no more integral than brown hair or detached earlobes. Finally, I'd like to make a point about identity and virtue. It is understandable for people to have an affinity for things that are like us, but within the context of common values and of a shared destiny, or simply within the boundaries of necessity and in our social interactions, we have to understand and identify with other people who are not like us in many ways. This is the heart and soul of the male-female relationship. It draws us out of ourselves and turns us into the sort of people we were meant to be. Civilization cannot live on men alone, nor can it live on women alone. It requires both genders to continue, and so marriage between a man and a woman is not merely a symbolic microcosm of civilization itself, but is the embryo of the virtues by which all of us can learn to empathize with and relate to each other. It is the binding together of what is opposite in nature but parallel in trajectory that forms the heart of any nation with a future. While deviance from this on an individual level is often acceptable and may even assist in the success of the society under certain circumstances, it simply cannot be claimed that homosexuality is integral to any civilization, Western or otherwise. And that's the conclusion of my opening.
All right. Do you want me to do the first response, or would you, considering I presented my argument first?
Whichever one is more convenient for you. If you've got a response ready, you can go ahead, or otherwise I can begin my response.
Feel free to go ahead, and I will give mine after you finish.
Okay. So we just heard Avialae reference Plato's Symposium, not only as a component of Western civilization, but actually as an early exemplar and descriptor of a uniquely Western institution, which is, how would we say it, courtly and romantic love. Oh, I should start my timer here. It is this kind of ideal which is designed to bind pairs of people together. You know, maybe male and male, maybe male and female, maybe... Plato didn't seem too fond of female-female bonds. He seemed to think that males were inherently superior.
Right.
I guess he didn't take the creation of future life into account, but we can leave that for another discussion. But according to Plato, this doesn't just justify homosexuality. If we are to take the text literally, we're not talking about homosexuality, but pederasty and probably pedophilia too. This is the sort of problem that many people run into when they try to read asymmetrical, parabolic, or metaphorical texts from history through the binary lens of truth and falsehood, which is a much more modern than most people give it credit for. And were we to grant that homosexuality lies at the heart of the Western mind because of this one text, or because some of our most powerful thinkers happen to be gay, it seems to me that we would be bound to accept that pederasty and pedophilia are also integral to Western civilization. We simply could not do without it. I hope we can all agree that we'd rather not dig through those ditches and burn through those witches again. But the point of the text remains. What's wrong with identifying with people who are like us, and is this not the best way to become our most ideal selves? I sort of addressed this in the opening, but maybe I can expand on it a little bit. One of the characters in the Symposium, Eric Symmachus, I believe was his name, the doctor there, was talking about the importance of health being the balancing of opposites. And this, I forget the name of the first speaker. Was it Aristophanes? I don't remember the name. But the first speaker was the one who made the case that men were superior, and that therefore it was more natural and better if you were to love and worship Eros based on virtue rather than mere appearance, to love men, specifically boys of who demonstrated good behavior and virtue. And it was natural for boys, the lovers, to find mentors, tutors, older men who could teach them to be virtuous.
Right.
I mean, on its face, it was ironic to me that you can't attribute to an author all of the views of the characters he portrays, necessarily.
Of course.
Because we've got different characters in the Symposium who are portraying different views. Socrates, of course, comes in and blasts them all away with his more even-keeled approach to the subject of Eros. But who is Socrates speaking on behalf of? He's speaking on behalf of a woman who he met at one of the temples. And it's her wisdom on the nature of love, which is for the purpose of procreation, because the ideal thing that we can do is reproduce ourselves. Well, male-male relationships have a hard time with that. Female-female ones have something like the same difficulty. Diotima, that I think was her name. And so the purpose of seeking love through virtue, as opposed to mere attraction. If we were to define the ideal form of Eros and attraction as merely being following physical attraction, that would actually be, I think, a stronger case for homosexuality, because many people, for whatever reason, and we have a very limited understanding of what causes homosexuality, it seems to be some blend of genetics, early childhood experiences, maybe abuse, and luck and choice. It seems to be a blend of those things, and no one's really sure what the proportions are. But if it was just physical attraction, that could be understandable enough. But if we're to decide these things through virtue, it seems to me that the appropriate thing to do would be to choose the sort of lover who would make you into the ideal kind of person. And given the divided nature of virtues between the sexes, right? We have someone like Jack Donovan talking about the male virtues. I don't know of a female equivalent of Jack Donovan describing the 4 female tactical virtues. But I think we're all in agreement that there are male qualities that we look up to as ideal masculine qualities, and there are ideal feminine qualities that we value. And we need both of those two things. And the blending of the harmony of these two things, not the erasure of them, but the harmonious incorporation of both of those, is the backdrop and the necessary foundation for any civilization to thrive on. And so if you were to use the Symposium, which says love founded in virtue is the ideal kind, not love founded on physical attraction alone, then it would seem to me that the Symposium would in fact be the strongest case against homosexual relationships, and a strong case for heterosexual relationships with a virtuous partner. I don't think I have much else to say, so I'll give the remaining 2 minutes to you.
All right, sounds good. Well, first and foremost, I think it's very significant for me to acknowledge the fact that I do agree with you on the basis of the fact that there are, of course, male virtues that are characteristics typically of males, and likewise for females. And of course, I do agree with you on the necessity of the harmonious relationship between the two. Now, as a gay individual, I do not stand in opposition to those things. I think that in the postmodern society in which we live, we've come to a very generalized assumption that to be a homosexual in modern culture, to have the identity of a homosexual, to have it to the point that it is so incredibly hypersexualized that encompasses the entirety of your identity, has caused us to have this presumption that it stands in direct contradiction to heterosexuality. And in homosexual culture, and what has developed out of the left in terms of homosexual culture, that's absolutely true in some cases. There are some that absolutely do shun the traditional family unit, and I vehemently condemn that because I do not believe in that. Now, I approach this from a direction that's a bit different than most homosexuals, because most do feel a certain level of reminiscence and understanding with homosexual culture. I go back and I look at different historical examples, whether it's from philosophical texts or whether it's from, different examples, like I mentioned earlier with Sappho. What's fascinating to me about Sappho is that despite the fact that she had an inclination towards women, she did produce children. Likewise, many men, homosexual or bisexual, still raised families. I think that this demonstrates to us the possibility of still maintaining our duties to an extent. As for myself, as an individual that has an inclination towards women, I still place great significance on the fact that producing children is important to me. Having a family is likewise important to me. So I think that there is a certain accommodation that can be had with this. I think that it is in contradiction to what our modern society would have us believe in terms of what it means to be a homosexual. Well, you're this type of sexuality and orientation, so we must approach it from this way. You identify as this, therefore this is the life you're going to lead. It's an incredibly categorized sort of concept and lifestyle that I think is directly detrimental to Western civilization. But I want to go back to a couple of points that you mentioned earlier that I think are incredibly important to discuss here. One of those being, you mentioned pedophilia and the normalization of pedophilia in that type of culture. Of course, any sane person condemns pedophilia, condemns the fact that, that's obviously immoral. There's not really much of a discussion to be had there. If we look at it in the context of the symposium and ancient cultures and civilizations of antiquity, we see they did have a bit of a different interpretation on it. It's also, like you mentioned, the fact that these relationships were often in pursuit of wisdom for the youth. It's very fascinating because Plato discusses that through these numerous characters, and he discusses why this is beneficial in their pursuit of wisdom. I think that this demonstrates to us a greater relationship than a mere sexual one, although, of course, in modern days we condemn a sexual relationship of that nature. I think that it is also important, however, to emphasize the fact that there are certain intellectual and philosophical characteristics that went into those as well. And it's also important for us to acknowledge that it wasn't quite as hypersexualized as we see today, like I said before, that the entirety of their identities doesn't necessarily revolve around that. Now, when I say that I believe that homosexuality has been an integral part of Western civilization, what I'm indicating by that is perhaps something I should clarify. Now, I do believe that we could both agree on the fact that homosexuals have provided absolutely irrefutable contributions to Western civilization. And if nothing else, a lot of individuals who acknowledge homosexuality as a legitimate occurrence, whether Plato was gay or not, whether he had homosexual inclinations or this was the manner of his writing, regardless of that, he did discuss these things and acknowledge their validity, which I think is important. And in so doing, and in the fact that these myths are present, and the fact that these certain elements and variables are present in these numerous stories throughout antiquity, I think demonstrates to us a significance there. Now, I don't believe in homosexuality being a quote-unquote integral part of Western civilization for the sake of the sexuality alone. I think that it's important to acknowledge, however, that these individuals have provided valuable contributions to Western civilization, and that they don't necessarily stand in opposition to the traditional family unit or the traditional values of the family unit, contrary to popular modern opinion. I think that the idea that one must stand in opposition to them as a homosexual is inherently erroneous and incorrect. I believe that it's perfectly possible to accommodate according to your sexuality. For me, like I said, one day I want to have children of my own with my wife. This is something that I desire, irrespective of the fact of whether I'm gay or not. I do place great significance on having children and understanding that. So I think that there's something to be discussed there in the potentiality of creating those accommodations, essentially. Discussing why these things happen, but also why these contributions to society have been so important. So not for the sake of the sexuality alone, but for the fact that homosexuals have provided useful contributions to our society. So when I discuss the fact that it's this quote-unquote integral part of society, I think it's important to also acknowledge that. So whether we look at antiquity or whether we look at modern political thinkers that are likewise homosexuals, irrespective of that, we do understand their contributions to society. We understand their relevance to society. And I think it also extends a kind of conversation to others that we need to have regarding these issues, and the fact that we're not so incredibly categorized according to our sexuality that we can't discuss these things on some level of commonality, which I think is something you would agree with. That's like something you mentioned earlier when you were discussing a higher form of love, essentially, that they were discussing with Socrates towards the end of the symposium. They were discussing the fact that these things are representative of a higher love, of what Plato would call the ladder of love, so to speak. That these physical attractions are ultimately representative of something higher, because you begin with the attraction to beautiful bodies, and you move to the attraction of the soul, and then you move to the attraction of these other things, these societal, cultural, spiritual things, that they extend beyond that. So I think that's something that also needs to be discussed, is the fact that irrespective of these things, ultimately, they should be in an endeavor to achieve that higher virtuous sort of love or relationship. So I think that is essentially a good summary of where I'm coming from here in response to what you were saying. So
okay, excellent. I think we're on now to the 15-minute freeform section, which, thanks to our early ends in a few of these cases, I think we can extend on a little bit longer if we'd like. So the first thing I wanted to touch on was the homosexuals being integral versus homosexuality being integral.
Right.
There are a lot of people across history who have contributed marvelous, or at least significant, maybe not good, but significant things to our history that aren't quite on the scale of shaping us in the way that the Indo-European migrations and the survival strategies adopted by our great ancestors, thousands of generations back, but were nevertheless, kind of emotionally and cognitively important to us, who did things like murder, or did other things that we generally don't agree with, or maybe they did things that are rather mundane, like they liked to do knot work, or maybe they liked to go for late night jogs, right? The fact that they would do something like that has no import on whether late night joggers or murderers or people who do not work are integral parts of civilization. It's the individual who's important. It sort of goes back to the separation of sexuality from identity that you were describing earlier, but I'm getting ahead of myself. In what sense is the homosexuality relevant to the discussion? If homosexuality itself isn't the matter in question. I suppose I could give an example here. You could make, hypothetically, an argument where maybe the works of Plato, or the works of Socrates, as the case may have been, or the works of Nikola Tesla, or some other, presumably or ostensibly gay intellectual who's contributed a lot to science and philosophy or whatnot, would not have been achievable if they were focused on dealing with the demands of a family and children and a wife and things like that. That's an argument that could be made. And in that case, if their discoveries and their contributions were so important to Western civilization that it just would not be the West without them, perhaps that could be argued. But I think there's quite a few contributions that are made by heterosexual people, and that one need not step away from the demands of a family in order to do that sort of thing. So why is homosexuality or homosexuals, like, why are they integral to the Western civilization rather than merely incidental to it?
Well, you mentioned the differentiation between homosexuality and homosexuals, and like I've said before, I think that is an important differentiation because, of course, I do believe that the discussion of sexuality is relevant to the conversation of Western civilization. I mean, we have the same conversation about heterosexuality, about controlling your passions, spiritualizing them, as Nietzsche would say, and how that is relevant to our culture and our philosophies. Now, in terms of the symposium, in terms of Plato's work, I think that there was a monumental statement to be made there regarding the fact that these virtuous relationships can be attained irrespective of whether it's a heterosexual or homosexual relationship. And this is a very, there's a very large common misconception regarding that, because it's assumed today, particularly by many conservatives, that that's not the case. They assume that you're inherently degenerate or you're promiscuous or you're hypersexualized due to the fact that you're a homosexual. I experienced this a lot myself, and a lot of accusations of degeneracy and everything else, despite the fact that I'm not promiscuous or any of these things. So I think there's an important conversation to be had regarding the fact that these virtuous relationships and the pursuit of wisdom and virtue is just as accessible to homosexuals as it is to heterosexuals, in my opinion. I believe that this can be attained in the same way and is just as accessible to them as it would be to heterosexuals. This is something that not many people on the right want to discuss because, as I've said, they want to inherently condemn them as being degenerates due to the fact that there is this sort of objectification by the left and by what I call homosexual modern culture. There is this assumption that it is mere sexuality that defines them. And this is the first error, I think, in this assumption. But I think that that's an important point to make, that these things are accessible to homosexuals, that it's not inherently degenerate to have this attraction, but according to what you do with it, just as is the case with heterosexuals, according to whether you choose to be more modest and spiritualize your passions, as Nietzsche would say, or whether you choose to be incredibly promiscuous, or, whatever the case may be, and indulge in carnality. Irrelevant of your sexuality. It's in terms of what you do with it. And I think that is a very important point. So when I discuss the relevance of homosexuality, I think that it's in acknowledgement of that statement, of the fact that in our pursuit of virtue and Western values and traditional values, that homosexuality is not inherently opposed to that. Now, along that same line of thought, I think it's also important to acknowledge, of course, as we've discussed, that, homosexuals have contributed a great deal to Western civilization. Of course, individuals like you mentioned, like Tesla and Plato and all of these other philosophical thinkers were possibly considered to be gay, or at least bisexual to some degree. Well, if that were the case with Plato, of course, that would be incredibly significant, given that he founded the first school of thought. But that's beside the point. That's for
Freddie Mercury alone, right?
Oh, yeah, you know it, man. It's important to acknowledge, I think, though. I think it's important to have that conversation. And along the same line of thought that I was just discussing with the sexualities, that we can stand in a sort of solidarity with individuals that are heterosexuals. Of course, that we're not directly in opposition to heterosexuals in Western civilization. That we can unify in the pursuit of these ideals and what we want our culture to look like. But this is
if you don't mind me jumping in
go
here,
ahead, go ahead.
I think this comes back to a point I actually neglected to address, which I should have earlier, that you brought up in your opening statement, which is the point of sexuality being a part of your identity. I think the reason why sexuality didn't appear to be part of one's identity in classical period was because it was somewhat unanimous. And anything that we all share in common isn't talked about because we're already in agreement on it.
Right.
The identity is tacit. We all breathe air, we all drink water, we all eat food. Those aren't points of distinction in the identities between Christians and Muslims, for example. There are a lot of other distinctions.
Absolutely.
But identity fundamentally comes from what you do. I think Master Chim is probably a very good one to go to on the subject of identity and its relationship with ritual and action and things like that. And the fact that identity, at least authentic identity, comes from what we repeatedly do, it seems difficult to me to separate one's sexuality from one's identity. And the trouble that I think a lot of conservatives see, and I see where they're coming from. I don't necessarily agree with them, but I see where they're coming from when they say, how can you avoid homosexual culture if it's individual exceptions aside, you've got these strong historical forces of aggregate behavior that are driving certain values, or at the very least rewarding certain values.
Absolutely.
Now, any given individual might hang out in certain circles that reward and punish different sets of values that don't necessarily align with their individual behavior. But if a particular group, like homosexuals, grows in number, or at least in political voice, and the behavior and the natural values of that group, which, I mean, at the most basic level is men fundamentally not caring about what women think, and women, at least lesbians, fundamentally not caring about what men think. Doesn't mean that any given lesbian or any given gay dude won't care about what, their mom or their dad thinks, respectively. But on the whole, will care a lot less. And I think what Nietzsche's actual definition of degeneration is, and I'd have to look this up, but I thought it was something like anything that turns someone's instinct against their own health and survival. It makes their instincts a danger to themselves. Right. And so I think it's in that sense, going back to where history derives from, particularly Western civilization, with the male-female bond providing that empathy that we need to understand each other and to build a civilization. Perhaps not a Tower of Babel, but at least a city together. And if you, I suppose if you erode that foundation, if you erode the need for that empathy, I think that's what the conservatives are talking about when they're talking about the degenerative quality of homosexuality.
Right. Well, that's understandable, and I understand the concern that many have of this sort of reactionary response that many have offered, particularly in quote-unquote homosexual culture, regarding heterosexuality, because, there has been this attitude that's been cultivated, of course, through political influences, that have proven to be detrimental in the pursuit of the traditional family unit. There have been, of course, influences that say you must be against this to represent who you are. And that's a lie. That is a bold-faced lie. I've always believed that to be an incredibly deceptive and manipulative tactic. I mean, it's essentially the same thing that we're seeing occurring with racial minorities and how they have been subverted into believing that one must be opposed to the majority in order to preserve a minority. And I don't necessarily believe that, because the fact is that, of course, homosexuals always have been a minority. And I'm not inherently threatened by that. I don't buy into this victimization mentality that has been perpetuated by the left. I don't buy into this idea that I'm inherently oppressed because I'm gay and I have those inclinations. I think that it's perfectly reasonable to discuss the fact that we need not be in direct opposition to one another. I've never believed that it's necessary to oppose the majority, in this case heterosexuals, in order to preserve my own abilities or rights, or however you want to discuss it. I think that to a degree we see this issue with political correctness, and I've discussed this in several of my videos, where you go from the point of acceptance into coercion under the guise of acceptance, and they say it's acceptance, but what it eventually becomes is coercion. But ultimately I think that's something that needs to be discussed, because the fact is that there is an increasing population of homosexuals who disagree with this notion. And I've seen this occur on a personal level as well in my involvement in the political world. I've seen more and more homosexuals say this is unacceptable, to assume that, one, we must be inherently opposed to the family unit or traditional lifestyle or virtues or values, whatever you'd like to call it. And two, to essentially demand that we adopt this victimization mentality, that we belief that we are inherently victims oppressed by the majority. So I think that we're starting to see a development in that many people are starting to understand this is not the way it's always been. We haven't always had this mentality.
Right.
If we look to older cultures, we see that it wasn't like this, that we didn't have this necessary desecration of traditional gender roles. We didn't have this desecration of the traditional unit. We didn't have this conflict that we are being told is necessary.
It does seem to be massive amounts of entitlement where they demand these sorts of things. I think that's actually why I took issue with the assertion that homosexuality was integral to Western civilization in the first place. I think a lot of the audacity with which a lot of these victim groups, which I know you well enough to know that you don't associate with these the victimhood ideology, but nevertheless the ideology sort of comes out of the opportunity for it, and I think it comes from a sense that of ability to do so. Well, they can't get along without us, or they can't in any case do much to stop us, so we may as well assert ourselves. So we're necessary. And I think it's important to say, a lot of people helped create Western civilization, but your sexuality had nothing to do with it. And the claim that homosexuality or homosexuals, or however way you phrase it really, are integral to Western civilization is itself a kind of identification with sexuality, which goes against what you were describing in the classical era where people didn't really identify via their sexuality.
I think that it goes into your identity to an extent, but it doesn't need to be this false dichotomy where it's either completely disassociated from your identity or it totally encompasses it. I think that there needs to be an understanding of the fact that, of course, it's part of who you are. Every individual has this sexual component to them. This is part of who they are. But it does not, by necessity, define who you are in every aspect. It need not encompass all of your influences, all of your perspectives, due to the fact that, well, you're a homosexual, therefore you must be associated with these particular political influences and circles. I think this is something that needs to be pointed out, because it's this understanding of the fact that while it is part of who we are, it doesn't entirely define who we are. There aren't these prerequisites that many have attempted to sell us into believing, well, if you're part of this category, then you have to align yourself with this train of thought. So I think that's an important thing to acknowledge.
Okay.
In terms of the entitlement, I'm not looking to say, in terms of the future, this is what we can do and this is why we should be here. But to me, it's looking into the past, not necessarily looking into the future and saying, well, this is a potentiality, but looking into the past and seeing those who have contributed to Western civilization, and the fact that homosexuals have proven their relevance in terms of Western civilization. Now, where the disagreement comes in is their sexuality's relevance. And I understand your point and where you are approaching this from, because it is understandable to think that it might not have any bearings at all. I think, though, in terms of our modern interpretation of homosexuals and this hypersexualization of all those who are gay comes from, I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that there really need not be this hypersexualized category that we have established in terms of sexuality, that you are obviously this promiscuous degenerate because you're gay. I think that is a common misconception that needs to be shattered, that we need to understand that many of us are just normalized individuals, that can have these conversations. And while we are different in terms of our sexuality, we're still capable of those intellectual contributions. So I think looking into the past reinforces the idea that those contributions are present and that it secures a place of understanding that those individuals have proven integral to the West. So, it goes back to what I was saying. Essentially, it goes into the disagreement regarding the pertinence of said sexuality. But we can have oh man, we could debate on that all night. But
So before we close out this back and forth section, I guess I should clarify, since this has become, I think, more hazy and not less. What do you think exactly is the significance of the homosexual contribution to Western civilization, and what do you think of the conflict that I brought up between what is required to accept homosexuals in our society, which is the damping down of our neural disgust circuits, versus the threat that we're dealing with from much less tolerant towards homosexuals or otherwise people that the repression of that disgust circuitry will also allow in.
As I mentioned earlier in the conversation, to answer the first part of your question, I think those contributions are primarily artistic, philosophical, that sort of thing. They've primarily contributed in terms of thought, and I mean, you mentioned Tesla and a few other individuals that have also provided different contributions. So I think there's different areas, and I could actually provide you with a more detailed description on this later if you're up for it. But the way I generalize it is saying that it's primarily philosophical and artistic. That's usually the contributions that I personally think of in terms of homosexuals contributing to Western civilization. When we look to periods of time during ancient Greece and ancient Rome, when we look at all of these different aspects that their culture encompassed, whether that be the philosophy or the art or any of these other things, we look at all of these different aspects that we praise and admire in what we think of to be classical Western civilization that are important. So I think that that's pretty much what comes to my mind anyway. That's something that's incredibly significant to me on a personal level when I think about that. To answer the second part of your question, I personally adopt a more, I don't say libertarian because there's a lot of conflicts with that, but a more, I suppose I could say constitutional perspective regarding that. Essentially, when it comes to it, it's like, you know, I don't see the need to have this totalitarian aspect, of course, you know, foreshadowing over everyone's decisions, but the ability and liberty to live as you will, and it harm none, you know, the quote unquote, the phrase there. I think that is incredibly influential in my own personal perspectives. But like I said, when it comes to this idea of this inherent oppression by the majority, I think that's complete and utter garbage. Of course, I totally reject that. And that is where we start to see the problems arise from this idea that we are oppressed, or we deserve reparations, or we deserve to be compensated for this or that, whatever, for these inherent oppressions, or whatever you want to call it, essentially. Those ideas are where we start to get into an area that it's proving to be detrimental to society. When you begin demanding, like you mentioned earlier, that sense of entitlement, it's very, very detrimental to society in general, and something that should definitely be rejected. So I think it's actually detrimental also to what they say that they want in terms of this reaffirmation of their identity, and yet oftentimes it comes down to this idea that, well, rather than having a reaffirmation in my identity, I now feel like a victim. And it's really counterproductive to many of their own concerns. So I think in that way, that's something that many in the homosexual, quote-unquote, culture that we see in modern society need to consider. The fact that that is inherently detrimental to our own cause. That, again, as I've said before, it's not necessary to stand in direct opposition to the majority or to heterosexuals, however you'd like to phrase it, in order to have the liberty to do what you will. So, yeah, that's pretty much how I would summarize the second portion of that statement.
So in other words, you think that if homosexuals can separate their identity from their homosexuality, at least as it's been sort of advanced by Marxist notions of equality and kind of hedonism that comes from materialism, then maybe the disgust circuitry won't be an enemy in the same way.
That's a good way of putting it. I think that's an accurate way of putting it, because that's how I see it. You know, it's the fact that we reject these, like you said, these hedonistic ideas. And heterosexuals deal with the same thing. I mean, we often see the same thing in which we see these individuals arguing over, well, this behavior is degenerate, that behavior, you know, being promiscuous is degenerate, and these sort of internal struggles that we see dealing with the same thing. And it is the same with homosexuals and dealing with those impulses and tendencies.
Okay. Well, at the risk of boring our listeners, because we're just hitting past 22 minutes here in this back and forth, we should probably do our brief conclusions. Would you like to go first or second?
You can go first, Chris.
Okay. Well, I have to admit, I wish I could share your optimism on the separation of identity and sexuality, and on the neuroplasticity of people's discuss circuitry. But I hope I'm wrong. We will see with time, I'm sure. I guess to reiterate my case, I think that identity fundamentally comes from what we do. And therefore, homosexuality is not necessarily incompatible with Western civilization, because there is division of labor, and there is room for experimentation and trying different methods, and also for eccentrics who have provided probably more for us by the 80-20 rule than hundreds of average people. All of that said, I think it is an overreach, and a damaging overreach, to say that homosexuality is an integral part of Western civilization, due not just in part to its fundamental opposition to the true core of Western civilization, which is the merging of opposites in the traditional marriage, which draws us out of our narcissistic tendencies towards repetition and makes us the best possible forms of who we were meant to be. But also because its advocacy tends to, and the acceptance of it, represses the forces that would protect us from forces of migration of a scale we haven't seen in thousands of years, of such strength that they literally forged us into who we are today, and could very well do that again. I think there is a balance that we can reach between the Scylla and the whirlpool, so that we can get the best of both. But it requires us not to overstep in either direction, nor to give too much social credibility to one group at the expense of another necessary group. In my view, conservative right-wing men are the best chance we have of preventing our country and our civilization from being completely overrun by people who do not share our deep history, and who consequently do not share our values, least of all a tolerance of homosexuality. I won't deny for a second that homosexuals have made contributions, and yes, positive contributions, to Western civilization. But it is an overstep to say that they, or the sexuality that they represent, are integral to Western civilization. And I'll leave it to you to close. You get the last word.
All right, sounds good. Well, I agree with you regarding, like I've said previously, and I want to reiterate this, the importance of the traditional family unit, and also reiterate the fact that, myself and many other homosexuals like me on the conservative side of the political spectrum agree that it is necessary, that the unity between men and women in the traditional marriage and family unit is necessary. It's a very important aspect, of course, as you said. I mean, it's a cornerstone of Western civilization, and I would never deny that very obvious and evident fact. In fact, like I've said, many on the right wing, I think, like myself, are quite enthusiastic to acknowledge that. It is incredibly important. But it's also important for us to understand that we don't necessarily stand in opposition to that we still have different ways of expressing our commonalities, both with heterosexuals and with others who don't necessarily agree with us, that we can move forward in pursuit of our societal ideals, in the pursuit of wisdom and virtue. And I think that ultimately is where my argument
lands is in this understanding that despite these differences, we do have commonalities upon which to progress and move forward, and that's very important. It's very important to understand that even in times of conflict and aggression, that we do have those commonalities. And if we, again, look at historical examples, like the Sacred Band of Thieves, when you had individuals and homosexuals fighting for the preservation of their homeland, that shows us a sort of optimism in moving forward and understanding that those commonalities are present, and that despite the ideological disagreements that we possess, that one does not necessarily need to exist in conflict to the other, that homosexuality, even as a minority, need not stand in direct opposition to heterosexuality, and that there are points of agreement upon which we can move forward with.
Okay, is that the end? You've still got another 3.5 minutes if you'd like.
I think I've wrapped it up and summarized it pretty well. So.
Okay, well that allows us to end in under an hour. Nice listening duration for anyone who's made it this far. So thank you so much for coming on, and good night everyone who's listened.